Good afternoon, everyone. We'll be getting started momentarily. We are waiting for more people as they sign in. We are also waiting for one of our speakers, so hopefully he'll be here shortly. So I'll give him another minute or two. Okay, I have a minute after 2. We're going to get started. I know more folks will be coming in as we start. We are waiting still for one of our presenters, but we will get started and hopefully he'll come in a little later. So I want to welcome everyone. We're glad that you're joining us for the COVID-19's Impacts on God's Creation and Vulnerable Communities webinar. Before we get started, we also have a little housekeeping as always. If you have audio issues, if you can't be hearing, consider switching to your phone. You can find directions to switch the audio from the computer to your phone in the audio box in your webcam, on your control panel. Questions can be submitted in the question box in your control panel. And yes, the webinar is being recorded and a link to the recording will be sent to you within 48 hours. We have been joined by our other presenter. I see that he probably can hear me. Dr. Wilson, welcome. We are getting started. When it is your time to speak, you have the choice to get on the webcam, and I can also transfer control of the panel so that you can show any slides if you like. But before we get started with the webinar itself, we always start with a moment of prayer. I chose Pope Francis's special prayer dedicated to the Laudato Si year. As you all know, this is the 5th anniversary of Laudato Si. We were celebrating the 5th year by celebrating it as a Laudato Si week. And the Vatican has announced that we will now be looking at a celebration of Laudato Si throughout the year until next May. And this is the prayer that Pope Francis asked the Catholic community to pray this year. And I call for you to silent our hearts. Remember that we're always in the presence of God. And if you will join me as I read the prayer. Loving God, creator of heaven, earth, and all therein contained, open our minds and touch our hearts so that we can be part of creation, your gift. Be present to those in need in these difficult times, especially the poorest and most vulnerable. Help us to show creative solidarity as we confront the consequences of the global pandemic. Make us courageous in embracing the changes required to seek the common good. Now more than ever, may we all feel interconnected and interdependent. Enable us to succeed in listening and responding to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. May their current sufferings become the birth pangs of a more fraternal and sustainable world. We pray through Christ our Lord, under the loving gaze of Mary, help of Christians. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. At this point, I would like to introduce to you our two wonderful presenters. They sent me their bios, and as I was saying to one of them earlier, I would have had to read 20 pages. So I have compressed, and hopefully I did justice to their work. They're going to help us examine how the COVID-19 pandemic has had enormous impacts and implications on vulnerable communities and God's creation. Today, we're going to be looking at what the COVID-19 pandemic is teaching us about our treatment of God's creation, how we can stand in solidarity with vulnerable communities during this pandemic and beyond. We also want to connect the dots between the pandemic and the disproportionate impacts being seen by low-income communities and neighborhoods of color. So I'd like to present our two speakers, and I am incredibly grateful that they accepted the invitation to speak today. The first speaker is going to be Father Sean McDonagh, and it's going to be followed by Dr. Sacoby Wilson. I'll let you know a little bit about each. Father Sean McDonagh is a missionary priest of the Society of St. Columban and the Society's researcher for justice, peace, and integrity of creation. He has advised the Vatican on the first draft of Laudato Si, and he wrote a book on care for our common home, which is found in Orbis Books, which takes the encyclical's full text and adds his reflections. He is an outspoken critic of the degradation of the environment. He links this to global poverty and the increased suffering of the poor. His understanding of environmental issues and the relationship between faith, justice, and ecology was awakened during his work with the indigenous Taboli people in the Philippine islands of Mindanao in the 70s and 80s. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. Dr. Sacoby Wilson is Associate Professor with Maryland's Institute for Applied Environmental Health and the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics and Director of Community Engagement, Environmental Justice Health, Maryland Institute for Applied Environmental Health, University of Maryland, College Park. I'd like to see his business card. His expertise in environmental justice and racism is in environmental justice and racism and also in environmental health disparities. He works primarily on the partnership with community-based organizations to study and address environmental justice and health issues and translates the research into action. He received his BS in biology and ecotoxicology from the Alabama Agricultural and Mechanical University, and then an MS degree from UNC Chapel Hill and a PhD from Chapel Hill. So very impressive resumes from both our presenters. And again, thank you for being here. First in the lineup is Father Sean, who will be speaking about the implications for the future from COVID-19. What are the implications for creation and vulnerable communities? Father Sean, you may take it from here.
Thank you very much, Faz, and I want to greet all the people who are listening to this presentation this afternoon. The first thing I want to say here is something that 6 months ago emerged in Wuhan in China. I have an interest there because when the Columbans went to work in China in 1920, the place they worked was in Wuhan City. So there, in the last 6 months, this pandemic has moved around the world. And the first thing we have to say is we have not handled it very well. Yesterday, in the United States, the richest nation on earth, 100,000 people have now died from COVID-19. Across from where I live here in Britain, almost 35,000 people have died from this. So in no way did the various governments take this seriously, even though anyone who would be looking at what has happening to these novel kind of viruses in the last 20 years would have seen a pandemic like this was just waiting to happen. The second thing, of course, is it touches us very deeply. I have a friend of mine who actually he's much younger than I am, in his early 60s. He went into hospital during this period and he got the virus and unfortunately died. And it was an awful experience for his family not to be there with them. And then after his death, he was brought straight to the cemetery without even a mass. So here's something extraordinarily deep in all cultures of the world, but particularly in Irish culture, where we celebrated people's lives during funerals. So many people have been touched by this, and it will take a long time for people to get over the grieving that has happened of not being able to see one of their loved ones, a father, a mother, brother or sister who had died from COVID. We always know that these pandemics have a huge impact on religion and on the world in which we live. One of the things I gave an example in the article I talked was about the Black Death from 1346, 47 to 1352. It probably wiped out about 50% of the population of Europe. But it had an extraordinary impact on our understanding of Christian relationship with the natural world itself. In other words, the natural world had no meaning whatever. And we took that into our religion. And it was central to our understanding that the natural world, they had no rights. We shouldn't really even be taking them seriously. We have no obligations to them. For example, we had after that a prayer at Mass during Advent, which said, "Teach us to despise the things of earth and to love the things of heaven." Now, I'd like to contrast that with what Pope Francis has done in this book, Laudato Si, which is an extraordinary document which was published 5 years ago. The Catholic Church began to get back and really understand that other species have intrinsic values and that they also are connected with them, is central to our way of living into the future. We are not, we're connected with every other species. We are people of the planet, we're people of the cosmos. So we have not had that in the past. For example, in the 1960s, when I was a student, the Catholic Church did a wonderful thing with the Vatican Council that brought the Church up to date. But there's nothing on the environment in actually the Vatican Council, even though Rachel Carson had published her book, Silent Spring, in 1962. So even then, and later in that decade, in the 1960s, Progressive Populorum, about the progress of people, very little on the environment. So we went right through until 2015. For example, in one of the drafts of Laudato Si, which appeared earlier, there was nothing about biodiversity, and there was very little about climate change. For example, previous Pope Benedict published an encyclical, Caritas in Veritate, in 2007, and never mentioned climate change. So we've been very, very poor at that. So Laudato Si has given us a great lift up, and it's way ahead of where many Catholics are at the moment. So then, to look at what happened, one of the most extraordinary things, if you were planning in January of this year, looking at the global economy, looking at economies in northern, but even in third world countries, you were talking about a certain amount of growth, maybe 2% or 3%. All of that has changed dramatically. The World Bank, the IMF have made very clear what has happened is we are now in a situation close to what happened in the Great Depression in the 1920s. Governments had to borrow hugely. Within about 3 weeks of this starting, the very basis for the Chicago School of Economics, that we live by the markets and that we don't run up debts. And what happens if it makes a society less, well, particularly if it does damage to the environment, that's not a question of ours. That has changed dramatically, and we'll see. We'll have to look and see, will that change in the future? And one of the things I'll talk towards the end of a thing that's happening at the moment, which is the automation that's taking place around the world. Will COVID-19, will that strengthen that? And I think that it will. So one of the areas that I talked in that article was the destruction of biodiversity. There are now 7.8 billion people on the planet. Every ecosystem has been taken over by humans. And so we have put enormous stress on other species. And because of this stress, we do know that viruses and pathogens can move from other species to human beings. And as I said, the virus, it seems to have emerged in Wuhan in the wet markets. And very often in these wet markets, you could get species from all different parts of China and even Africa together, species that would never live cheek by jowl with each other. And in a sense, that's exactly what has happened. The challenge of this virus is it's very easy to pick it up. It's not as deadly as SARS was, but has gone right around the world and has changed quite a number of things. So we are now being challenged to think much more seriously about what's happening to the natural world. My own experience on this came when I in the 1970s was working with the Sacoby people on the island of Mindanao. I was living in a rainforest, and there was huge pressure on the rainforest by logging companies. And of course, I realized over the 15 years I was there, as the forests began to be destroyed, the impact on the tribal people was actually much worse, because mosquitoes had little other creatures to be except for biting human beings. So you could see the destruction of the natural world was having a huge impact on people as well. And in a sense, we must begin to take much more seriously. It is presumed that by the 2050, there will be 10 billion people on the planet. So would that mean that all areas of Africa where other wild beasts are living today, will all that be taken over for humans? And we also have to understand it's not just what's happening out there. Look at what's happening in, for example, our modern industrial agriculture. We raise pigs, cattle, sheep, turkeys in very cramped spaces. And in these situations, we often give them antibiotics in resistant pathogens in their feed. And we have known that in many situations, antibiotic resistance pathogens have developed and tried. So is this going to happen much more in the future? And in many ways, it will. So we're going to have to take that much more seriously. Is this the way we want to live? It's a very big question here, for example, in Ireland, because one of our major exports is beef and dairy products to Europe. But that does mean also that in a country like Ireland, that 33% of our greenhouse gases are actually are taken up by agriculture. And is this the way into the future? And people say, well, they're producing food for people to eat. But producing meat and producing milk is not the best way to produce food for everyone. So countries are going to have to take these issues much more seriously, as will the religions. What are the ethical issues of the way we actually are working with factory farms at the moment? And we kind of believe the fallacy that the natural world will not, what we do will not have a negative effect on the natural world itself. The reality is it does have a huge effect and will continue to have a huge effect, particularly as more and more humans live on Earth and more other creatures are moved into places across the globe. So those are some of the major issues that has taken place. As I said initially, the Black Death had a huge impact on the religious realities of Christianity from the 15th century onwards. And in a sense, I think that's going to also be true of COVID-19. But even before COVID-19, for example, many of you will be familiar with Johanna Zuboff's book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, where she talks about what's happening in our modern world. And one of those areas we're moving towards automation. Remember what I said, preparing for COVID-19, we just did not do it. Despite all our understanding, all our great learning in many of these areas. I believe, in a sense, that this is also happening with the kind of realities of automation. Many people will say that within maybe 2 decades, 30 to 40% of people will not have paid employment. So how are we going to work with that into the future? We say at the moment, if you have 15 or 20% of people unemployed, it has a huge negative impact on on society. And yet, these are the kind of things that are happening at the moment. And we again, will we be prepared for it? And this is not just a question for politicians, for economists. It's a question for every community. It is a central pastoral issue for churches and synagogues and mosques, because they're going to have to understand, how are people going to live? How can you create a situation where there's an equitable reality in a society, rather than have one people who are producing all these new technologies, very rich. We could see actually during the pandemic in the last 2 months, the founder of Amazon, he increased his wealth by $30 billion during those 2 months. So is that we want? Very few people very well off, and the rest of people at almost starvation. So people are going to have to begin to say that we want a very different way of living in the future. And the way governments have been challenged to support people during the pandemic may be part of what's going to happen into the future. And people like myself, I'm just writing a book at the moment, are talking about basic income being a central dimension of people living in the future. Because if they don't have that and have no access to constant employment with terms of reference for when they get sick and having a pension, if all of it is going to be reduced down to what's called the gig economy, then society would not be a nice place to live. So those are some of the issues, I think, the issues of economics, which we saw immediately after COVID. As I said, I was living in a country where most people had jobs. Unemployment was down to about 4%. It's now 33%, and could remain like that for 5 or 6 months more. We actually don't know until we see a cure, some level of a cure, or also some level of a vaccine into the future. So, as I said, this is a central issue for people, and there are many different aspects to it, from not taking the trouble to really understand the potential for pandemic in the beginning, and we're the same level of not being aware of how society might change. For example, the chief executive of Microsoft said very recently that they had done much more research on automation in the last 3 months than they had in the previous 3 years before that. So the pressure is on. And is that what society wants? For example, driverless cars and trucks in countries like the United States and here in Europe as well. We need to know how these things are moving, and that people have an opportunity to be heard on what's happening, and also will have an opportunity to live in a society where they can live well, and where what Pope Francis talked about, the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, being able to respond to those.
Great. Thank you so much, Father Sean, for giving us this big macro view of what's going on and the connections between ecological justice. We're going to then, I think, go into more of a micro of what is happening with communities of color and poor communities. Dr. Wilson, welcome. Let me bring that up here. I need to ask you, Dr. Wilson, do you have a PowerPoint to share?
Yeah, I have a couple of.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a PowerPoint. I'm going to bounce through a couple things. Yes.
Yes. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and make you presenter so you can share your screen. Okay.
Okay.
Do that right now. So you should be able to share your screen in any minute, and that's what folks will be seeing.
Okay.
And welcome. You may start.
So thank you again for the invitation. So I'm going to talk about, what's happening in communities of color when it comes to COVID-19, and follow up on Father McDonagh's discussion points about some of the issues that we see when it comes to climate change and our Earth. But what the first thing I want to show you is a map of COVID-19 cases from around the country. This is from Johns Hopkins University. You can see a map with the darker color has more confirmed cases. So on the left side of the map, you see the top 50 confirmed cases by county: Cook County, Illinois, Chicago. And then on the right side, you can see top 20 counties by number of deaths. And so this just brings in the picture right now that we have over a million cases in the U.S., confirmed cases. As someone in public health, you know, when you think about pandemics, when you think about viruses or any type of outbreaks with bacteria, usually there's an undercount. So we probably have far more, maybe 10 times the number of people may actually have a COVID-19 infection, whether it be asymptomatic or symptomatic. And then you have, you know, again, the issues with mortality that we see in the country. And we have over 100,000 individuals who have perished due to COVID-19 infection related complications. And I want to zoom in for you to my state. I'm in the state of Maryland. And so this shows you a map of affected counties in the state and the number of cases by county. I actually live in Prince George's County, Maryland. So as you can see from the right-hand panel, affected counties, that's the legend. You see that as you go from lighter color to darker color, you have more confirmed cases. So we have been designated as one of the wealthier counties. And this is something that happens in our state, one of the wealthiest counties in the country for Black folks in the whole country, supposedly. But look at our case rate. And so the reason why I'm highlighting this is because COVID-19, regardless of supposedly having all this economic resources in our county, we've seen the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 on communities of color across the country, whether it be in some of the boroughs in New York, whether it be in Chicago, Illinois, whether it be in Detroit, Milwaukee, New Orleans. What's the link in those cities? The link is Black and brown people. Black and brown people. So why have we seen these disproportionate impacts from COVID-19 when it comes to Black and brown people? I'm going to talk about that now. In this country, in the U.S., we have not just structural inequalities, we have structure inequalities, where you have some communities, if you think about the social terms of health, who do not have access to certain resources. There's been a lot of discussion about the fact that African Americans and Latinx populations, where they have higher rates of diabetes and obesity. That didn't happen by accident. That didn't happen by circumstance. You have to understand context. Think about the issues around food environments. Father just talked about it. We have food insecurity in communities of color. Many communities of color have limited access to healthy, nutritious foods. They have something called a food desert, where they may not have a grocery store within walking distance or drive distance to their home, or they may be in a food swamp, where you have multiple food outlets, but they are serving unhealthy foods like a McDonald's or Wendy's, or name any fast food restaurant that tend, for some reason, to be disproportionately cited in communities of color. Or they may not have a grocery store, but they may have a dollar store. That dollar store may have unhealthy foods, high prices, and not a lot of healthy choices, or a convenience store. So the food infrastructure is a big part of the problem. You've seen the data that's shown that many of the people who've died from the infection, they had some underlying health condition. That is true, but you cannot focus on that and not look at the context of why you see these disparities in obesity, disparities in diabetes, disparities in metabolic syndrome in communities of color. So the food environment is a part of that. We also know that African Americans, Blacks, and Latinos had limited access to healthcare infrastructure. And I'm going to talk about that in three different ways. You have underinsurance or uninsurance, and that's related to economics. Many live in communities that are under-resourced, and they're low wealth communities. So they may not have the ability to, pay for insurance, have insurance. They may also live in a community where they don't have access to healthcare infrastructure. So if they do have access to healthcare infrastructure, there may be infrastructure where they have limited hospital beds, infrastructure where you have limited staffing, and there's a whole issue around medical mistrust. Many of you've heard about the Tuskegee syphilis study. There's been other studies where people of color have been used or abused by medical research. So that's a natural distrust there of medicine and medical research. In addition, because of lack of cultural competency, when you do go to the doctor, right, and you're looking for care, you get turned back. You've heard many cases of Black folks, Latinos, who go into the hospital during this pandemic, and they had symptoms of infection, but they were turned back and later died. They didn't get the service that they deserved, right? So you have those issues around healthcare. Then you also have the issues of the fact that in many of these communities, we're talking about our economy, as the fathers talked about. We need to change our whole economic structure. Right now, we have a lot of essential workers who are Black Latino, essential workers who are driving buses, essential workers who are doing childcare, essential workers who are doing gig economy, essential workers doing retail. So our economy in this country, our global economy, is based on the haves being able to stay at home, like me, being a person of class privilege who can stay at home and still get a paycheck, and the have-nots who have to go out and work. And then what happens is then they're in these environments where they're overcrowded, the lack of proper ventilation, the lack of proper disinfection, which increases the transmission rates and also modifies their susceptibility factors. If you're around people a lot who are asymptomatic or symptomatic, you have a greater chance of being exposed to the virus and being infected by the virus. So this haves and have-nots in the U.S. is part of the reason why you see the increased morbidity rate and increased mortality, because a lot of Black folks, a lot of Latinos are essential workers. And think about our vulnerable populations. We pre-COVID-19, we had already made a number of populations invisible, whether it be folks who are in prisons, whether it be family members in nursing homes, whether it be individuals working in meat packing, or whether it be our frontline healthcare workers. Those populations are disproportionately people of color who were made invisible, but COVID-19 have made those populations visible. You see some of the highest case rates in meatpacking, in our prison system, and also in our nursing homes. And also in healthcare, our workers, whether it be nurses, doctors, and we think about the staff, along with those nurses and doctors who work in those hospitals, they are disproportionately people of color. So we have to think about those issues. But in addition, we have issues around environmental injustice. You have many communities that host environmental hazards, whether it be landfills, petrochemical facilities, highways, where they've been exposed to co-pollutants, greenhouse gas emissions that can impact human health. So if you are in a community with a lot of air pollution, a recent Harvard study has shown that long-term exposure to particulate matter, PM 2.5, that's 2.5 microns, can lead to an increased risk of mortality due to COVID-19 infection. Why is that important? You have communities of color who are hosting these air pollution sources. They've been exposed to air pollution. They were exposed to air pollution constantly before COVID-19. But the problem with particulate matter is it just doesn't cause, it increases your risk of dying from COVID-19, but it also increases asthma rates. So you see asthma-related disparities in these communities. Also increases your risk of stroke, of heart disease, increases your risk of cancer, increases your risk of having a low birth weight baby, infant mortality, birth defects, increases your risk of diabetes, of Alzheimer's. So communities of color who are hosting these pollution sources are being exposed to air pollution all the time. But COVID-19 has made this worse. Also, studies have shown that on some of the particles, you can see long-range transport of the virus. So if you're in a community that's dealing with a lot of air pollution, you have an increased risk of mortality associated with COVID-19. Now, why is this important for the encyclical? Where climate change is an issue that's going to impact all of us, but it's going to differentially impact some of us. The ones that are impacting greenhouse gas emissions the least are the ones that are going to be impacted by climate change the most, whether it be think about developing countries or whether it be communities across the U.S. who host these pollution sources. So you can get communities like those in Charleston, South Carolina, dealing with goods movement, or Savannah, New Orleans, any communities dealing with ports, any communities that are dealing with major highways. They're going to be disproportionately impacted by climate change. You think about the history of slavery in this country, enslaved Africans. Where are the descendants of enslaved Africans living in this country? They live primarily in the South, the Southeast, the Deep South. What's in the Southeast and Deep South? We're getting to hurricane season. Think about it. This is the 15th anniversary in 2 months, 3 months, 15th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. This year right now is the 25th anniversary of the Chicago heat wave in 1995. This year is also the 10th anniversary of the Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf Coast. Why did I mention those events? Because with COVID-19, you basically have the intersection of multiple disasters. So regardless if it's a biological disaster like COVID-19, a natural disaster, or a technological disaster, the folks who are going to be impacted the most are always the most vulnerable, right? Populations I've already talked about. This is a major environmental justice issue. This is a major issue of our humanity. So how can we do better? What should we be doing right now to take care of our vulnerable, to take care of those who the least of these? We should be making sure that we change our economic system, as already mentioned. We have to have a different economy when dealing with a pandemic and dealing with the natural disasters, whether it be Hurricane Katrina, next Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Florence, the next forest fire, the next tsunami, the next earthquake. We have to rethink our economy. We have to move away from fossil fuels. As was mentioned, concentrated animal feeding operations, the global production of animals has to change. We've seen the benefits during this pandemic, one silver lining of how air pollution levels have improved. Air quality has improved. What can we do to keep that? We have to move away from burning fossil fuels, whether it be at power plants or our vehicles. We have to move away from large-scale animal agriculture, intensive animal agriculture. We have to change the way we live in society. And one thing that's been important for me as a Black man, I want to say this. We also have to change the way we relate to each other. What we've seen in this pandemic is people's humanity has been ignored. People have been made invisible. We're seeing people who have been attacked because of their skin color during this pandemic. You're seeing basically lynchings that are happening by different groups of folks, whether it be police officers lynching Black men. I'm gonna call that out, because what happened in Minnesota was horrendous. Black man killed in Georgia. We're seeing people not treating each other, and it's already here in America, less than human. And that's one thing about environmental justice is important. It's where we need to be able to treat each other and recognize our humanity. And I think in this time, in the post-cyclical, it's a time for us to step up. And all of us, whether it be someone like me, who's a Black man, if you're not Black, we all should connect. We all should be part of the human race. And we all need to step up to do better. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let me switch presenter again. Hold on.
Let me stop sharing.
Yeah, I need to do that from you.
How do I stop sharing?
Go to the attendees, and there you stop sharing.
Okay, is that it?
Yep,
Okay,
you did it. Thank you. Excellent. Thank you. That was excellent from both of you. I do have a couple of questions, but folks, if you have questions, please write them in that chat question box, and I can then read them out to both Dr. Wilson and Father Sean. One question that I have here already, let me bring it up again, because, okay. It has to do with how in the United States, the political system seems to be afraid of the word socialism, and how we respond to the needs of the poor are usually seen as that's socialism. The question that is being asked. And I think this one may be first to Father Sean, but of course, Dr. Wilson, you're also welcome to respond. How Laudato Si responds and is relevant to that question of excess capitalism versus responding in a socialist manner.
Well, the encyclical is very clear on that. The encyclical has no time whatever for the School of Chicago, where laissez-faire economics and lack of interference by government is the be-all and end-all of economic order, even though that creates a society that is very unjust and very inequitable, and it also creates a society where you just get rid of everything out into the environment. Just at this point in time, myself, I'm doing a lot of work on plastics, and they're doing an enormous damage to our oceans. And now we're finding that there's more plastic in the oceans than there are many other creatures there, and they're now feeding on them. So within a couple of years or a couple of decades, we could have an enormous destruction of our oceans. And yet, almost everywhere you go, both in first world and third world countries, plastic has become the way of actually marketing food. I'm going to buy potatoes. I don't need a plastic bag or a plastic thing to have my potatoes or carrots or whatever. So in those very simple realities, the encyclical is that it is an economy that works for people, but that it is also a sustainable economy, because that wasn't at all anything got to do with the Chicago, with Milton Friedman and these people in the 1960s and 70s. And sure, they made a lot of money for countries and even in China, but that's not the way to organize society into the future. We are, as we said, we are living with extraordinary changes, like climate change is an extraordinary change. And within 30 or 40 years, if we keep at what we're doing and don't begin to actually to live up to the Paris Agreement of 5 years ago, many places on the planet will be too hot for people to live in. For example, I'm a Columban, and many people would tell you when we went to some countries like Pakistan, you may have 2 or 3 days of the year where the temperature is over 50 degrees Celsius. Now they're much more, and in the future there will be much more. And this is something that will continue to hurt people, into not just people, other creatures into the future. And it's even worse with biodiversity. We're beginning at least to think something about climate change, but we're very poor in understanding that we are living in an extraordinary period, the 6th largest extinction of life since life began. The last time something like this happened was 65 million years ago, and yet we're not even worried about it. Like this afternoon, I was looking here at the faith community's action to help pollinators, and we give these to Christian communities in parishes. For example, in Ireland, we have a real problem now with insects. We have here in this country about 96 different kinds of bees. But this the study by the National Biodiversity Centre, we will lose maybe 1/3 of them in the next 2 decades unless we take care of them. We're not taking care of them because we're destroying their food. Now, how are we going to live without pollinators into the future? I mean, there are groups of people in Holland are talking about making pollinators. But so we're challenged at every level, and particularly the level, as the other speaker said, the economy. The economy as it has been practiced for the so-called developed countries, but worse even for the developing countries, has been a disaster and cannot continue. And one thing, climate or the pandemic has made it absolutely clear that it can't continue. So,
thank you. Dr. Wilson, you can follow up on that, but can you also touch on how air pollution itself, can you talk more a bit how air pollution makes COVID-19 worse and how that impacts communities of color and poor communities the most?
Okay, cool. I'll get both. So yeah, just to follow up real quickly, I think we have a lot of socialism in the U.S. already. So whether it be Medicaid, Medicare, a lot of our social programs I mean, think the CHIP program, the child insurance program. I mean, we have a lot of it built into the society, and I think those are really good benefits and good resources. And I agree about the point about the laissez-faire approach. That to me, there's an invisible hand that's been always relegating certain communities to host these land uses. And the term I didn't use earlier, I'll just use it real quickly. I mean, I think in the U.S. we have what we call a lot of environmental slavery. And what do I mean by that? So Father talked about these externalities. Some communities are basically used to host land uses that lead to externalities. So their ecosystems are used as sinks for pollution, but also their bodies are used for sinks for pollution. I mean, these communities that work, and this is what we're talking about. So you think about the issue of air pollution. What happens is, you have a pollutant like particulate matter. It can damage your lung sacs, right? It can damage your alveoli. You have different sizes of particulate matter. So we have PM10, which is 10 microns. That's the stuff you sneeze out. 2.5 in ultrafine particles, 1 micron. They can go into it. So after they do the damage to the lungs, they can then be moved through your circulatory system to different organs and impact those organs. But think about if you have think about your lung capacity is 100%, and then you have reduction lung capacity due to damage associated with some type of exposure to particulate matter or some other pollutant. It could be volatile organic compounds. It could be any number of combustion byproducts. That reduces your lung capacity, and that reduces the health of your lungs. So then COVID-19 comes in. It's easier for you to be infected when you have that damage to your capacity. And then because you have unhealthy lungs, you have an unhealthy respiratory system, it's going to be harder for you to overcome that. And as you heard, as I said earlier, a lot of the mortality has been due to folks who've had some kind of underlying health condition, right? So you've seen folks who may have been overweight. This is a different point. Who've died due to that COVID-19 infection. But you've seen a lot of folks who've died who've had an underlying respiratory condition. So if you are in an area where you have poor air quality, you have reduced lung capacity, and you have damaged lungs, that's the reason why when you get infected by COVID-19, your risk of death dying prematurely have been increased.
Thank you. We're getting
one thing I'd like to say here.
Yeah.
I'd like to say here, like the fact that the United States has moved out of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, in my estimation, that's extraordinary, and it is totally immoral, because the impact of what could happen into the future is unbelievable, and that the richest nation in the world would take this, and this is not seen as a moral issue. Now, when I hear people supporting these people that come from a religious background, I just want, what kind of religion is that will support this completely irresponsible move and people have learned to accept it. They should be rioting in the streets of Washington. That this is the future of our planet and for human beings, and it's unbelievable and immoral.
Yes, sir.
Yes, it is, and we're probably not going to get to everybody's questions. I think 30 questions came in the last 2 minutes as you were speaking. But I think I'm going to merge a few of them. One of them has to do with the whole idea of being fully pro-life. One of the ways of one of the questions is looking at it that they were encouraged to see how consistent ethic of life seems to permeate at the Vatican now. That the Pontifical Academy for Life is taking the issue of COVID-19 and vulnerable people as a life issue. And they want to know from Father Sean, is the US dynamic of the anti-abortion movement merging with conservative politics unique to the US, or do you also see it in Ireland, other parts of Europe, or other parts of the world?
It's mainly in the US. It wouldn't be here. This ideology is here, but it wouldn't be driving things as it does in the United States. And yes, we have to be very serious that we're totally pro-life. We also have to be very serious in the Catholic Church. We still do not take seriously issues of human levels of population. About 30 years ago, I wrote a book on the greening of the church, and I was living with a tribal group in the Philippines. And I just give an example, like when the Spaniards left the Philippines in 1898, when the Americans took over, there were 6.5 million Filipinos. There's now over 100 million. And are we taking that seriously? And if you're talking about a coherent reality of pro-life, you have to take it right across the board. Is it okay that there's 10 billion humans on the planet, but every other species has been wiped out? Do they have any rights to participate in our planet as we do? And that's an area I don't think the Vatican is still taking not seriously enough, and I think it's very important.
The next set of questions has to do with being specific for the solutions. So, like, what are 3 specific things that we can do to change the course we are on? What are specific actions for Catholics and also for Catholic universities and colleges to address these issues? So it's more of the solution. How do we as Catholics walk in solidarity with the communities impacted? Dr. Wilson, do you want to try that one?
On climate change, there is at least across the board that we don't allow to go up by more than 1.5% in the next 10 years. So I mean that people locally might begin to do. How do you do that in terms of the way you travel, the way you heat your homes, and all of that, and that these choices are taken, and that we now begin to make choices that we use more renewable sources of energy. I think that's very important. The same needs to be done on the whole area of biodiversity. And unfortunately, one of the areas that we don't take seriously is what we're doing to our oceans. We have done enormous damage in the last 30 years, probably more than, and the oceans were where life began. Life was in the oceans for 3 billion years before it actually came in on land. And we treat them as if they were sore. And again, universities or dioceses, like I'm saying here in Ireland, every one of the dioceses touches the sea, and yet I don't know of a single diocese has a program. What's happening to the sea? What can we do about it? How can we draw up a program as Christians that we give thanks to God for this wonderful reality that the sea is? Because without it, there would be no life on this planet. So it's about addressing these issues, try to break them down, see how people can do things about it, and put pressure particularly on the economics and on politicians. And that has to happen on plastics, because if it doesn't happen within, I'm the age of plastics. I'm now 75 years of age. Plastics came in after World War II, and they've done enormous damage, and we're not even aware of it, and they will do damage for hundreds of years. So we need to begin to take very serious critical action about that.
Thank you, Father Sean. Dr. Wilson, would you like to respond as to what Catholics can do to deal with this issue? Because sometimes Catholics don't see it.
Yeah, so I think one thing is, and I've had some conversations with a few colleagues recently about what Catholic Church could do in the DC area. I think as it relates to the churches, the physical infrastructure that you have, that is a resource, that's an asset. How can you make the church a one-stop, I'm getting back to COVID-19, a one-stop shop to help with community wellness? You have folks who lost their jobs. You have folks who do not have access to healthcare, who do not have access to medicine, who need income. These are really basic needs that people have right now. What is your archdiocese doing? I'm being in the U.S., but there's other countries, but talking the U.S. context now, to really serve local communities. In many cases, not just Catholic Church, but other churches, you may have a church that's physically located in the neighborhood, but the people who live in the neighborhood don't go to that church, are not attached to that church, are not connected to that church. So making your physical infrastructure an asset for local communities. Now, think about climate change, making that church a resilience hub. When power goes out, when there's a flood, when there's a heat issue, how has the church become a real resilience hub? So having backup medical supplies, backup water, backup power. And so creating a map of your churches to know, say, when you have community and mapping your vulnerable populations. So when you have a heat event, you have a flood event, you have a storm event, that's a place to go, because we have medicine, we have food, we have water. That's real world, real life right now that needs to happen as relates to climate change, but also you can do a similar thing as it relates to COVID-19. Now look at the bigger picture when it comes to climate change. I think we have to talk about climate justice and climate equity. For a lot of communities I work in, they've been already dumped on. So how can you flip the way we talk about climate change and talk about it for more proximal, make it more proximal, make it more everyday, make it more pocketbook. Food, faith, family, health, and jobs. That's going to connect with folks that I work with, because some of the bigger stuff, they're not seeing the bigger stuff. It's not proximal. Make it proximal, make it pocketbook, make it everyday. That change in the messaging is going to bring more people in. Think about climate action resiliency plans, where you talk about workforce development, where you talk about education, get into the universities, having climate justice curriculum, climate, put really, if you're going to talk about it, be about it. So train the students and have them do service projects, have them work with community-based organizations. You know, changing our whole food system is going to be important. Getting people's hands really into the earth, connecting back to the land through the curriculum, partnering with local community groups to help with that. Folks who are coming out of the prison system, folks who are in these different vulnerable states, how can you bring the schools to actually be more resourced and be more actively engaged in improving people's lives? I'll stop there. I can keep going, but yes, hopefully that helps.
There's one thing I'd like to say is we need to challenge the church also. You see, as Catholics, we are schizophrenic. What do you go to Sunday Eucharist, to giving thanks to God about the beauty of the planet, doesn't happen at all. We believe one thing, that the earth is not good in our liturgies, and a totally different thing in Laudato Si. So we need to get it correctly. And we also need, one of the main issues I see in the Catholic Church is the sexist language. It's appalling. And the sexist reality of other people, particularly women, not having access to roles within the church of governance. So at the moment, I'd say people should be shouting at their bishops, get us a decent liturgy that actually does talk about the beauty of God's creation as a central dimension of our faith. So the phrase in Latin, lex orandi, lex credendi. What we believe is what we share, is what we pray. That's not true at the moment. What we pray is totally different from what we believe in Laudato Si, and it would be very important for the church to get that one right.
Thank you. I don't think we have time for another question. If you've asked a question and we haven't responded, I will respond to it or give it to one of the presenters if I can't, for them to respond, and hopefully they'll be okay. The only thing I want to finish with is, I think what I got from this conversation is all these issues are so interconnected, and that is exactly what Laudato Si is all about. That we can't separate the economic justice, the racial justice, the climate justice, the biodiversity issues. They are so interconnected. And as a community of faith, we have to be able to respond to all of these issues, giving some weight sometimes to those basic needs that are out there right now. Sometimes we kind of figure, how do we talk about climate change in a time of a pandemic when people's basic needs are not being met? We need to be able to respond to those basic needs and talk about the longer crisis of the climate change crisis, because they will be interconnected. I want to thank both of our presenters. Thank you so much for this incredibly good conversation. If anybody has any more questions, you can send a question to me at paz@Catholic Climate Covenant or at info@catholicclimatecovenant.org. A big thanks to everybody who attended today. The recording will be sent to you within the next 24 to 48 hours. And again, thank you to our presenters, thank you to you, and hope you have a wonderful rest of the day, and prayers are rising for everybody's health and well-being in the next months ahead. God bless.
Take care.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you.